Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of, I almost said Not Your Mama's Therapy. How about that?
Betrayal.
Wow. I know, right? To the Practice of Love podcast. My name is Lair Torrent. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, the author of the book, The Practice of Love, and I am joined, as always, with my love, my sweet, my better half, mother of my children, surf partner, and coffee talk person.
Yeah,
Ashley
I'm back
Torrent.
on coffee. I don't know.
You are back on coffee.
I don't think
God.
anyone knew I was off for a while.
Oh, I did. I knew you were off. I absolutely knew you were off coffee. Jesus. That's all I could do to get you back on.
Yeah, tea just wasn't cutting it.
Tea, some kind of mushroom water, there's always some sort of chai scenario. You just need
remember the chai that I made last year? Like, I remember our friend Anna tasting it and just being like, oh. It was so strong.
Right, because you're trying to make it coffee and it's not.
Because I like my coffee strong, and I was trying to make chai like punch in the face, and it was barely palatable. It would the cinnamon in it would burn my tongue.
I could smell it. You
left
whipped it up
like
in a cauldron.
It was like an inch of residue at the bottom of it, all the powders I'd mixed together.
My nervous system doesn't do well. No, you know what? You need to just teach it to allow for coffee.
Well, we're back on coffee in the mornings, at least.
Well, and I think it serves our podcast. It makes it more interesting. It makes it more fun. I have my coffee right here with what's left of it, and I'm going to have a little sip.
Okay. Well, I have cacao because I'm really into cacao right now. No, I'm not going to go into it. I'm just going to say I'm into cacao. So that's what I'm having today. Today is not the time to have a conversation. I'll get too mad. I like to explore. I am a seeker.
You are indeed, if nothing else, you are a seeker. Yes, a seeker of all things other than coffee, and you just circle back to coffee.
No, now I got this. These are great. They're coffee in the morning, cacao in the middle of the day. It's great.
Mm-hmm. Our friend Kelly, who is also a therapist, she posted on Instagram. She posted on Instagram that she was trying mud water, and she wrote kind of in the how long until I'm back on coffee, and I instant messenger and I said, listen, you and I both know what you're going to do. You're going to try that shit, and you're going to hope for the best, but you are going to be drinking coffee. Just give it up. Do it, Ashley. You have to come back to coffee. Just come back. I said, this is like a bad college relationship. You just keep coming back over and over again. And she wrote me and she said, you know what I did? She's like, I drank the mud water and immediately had a cup of coffee.
Exactly.
So what are we talking about today?
So you were going to bring a topic to us to discuss. What is your topic?
Well, you wanted to talk about my question, and you actually talked about the question on your podcast with Mildred. You on the Blue Butterfly Effect. You brought it up and said that you thought it was a pretty profound question.
And yes, I think we should discuss it.
Yeah, and I think it's an important one. Maybe one of the most important questions, and that is, how are you who you are? Given everything that you've been through, everything that's happened, all the trauma, all the darkness, all the sad, all the poor parenting, the bullying, how are you? And I ask this to all of our listeners as well, having gone through what you've gone through, because I'm going to imagine that people who are listening to our podcast probably haven't had a pristine life. And I don't know many people who actually have. So this question can cast kind of a broad net. How are you, given everything that you've gone through, everything that you've been through, all the sad, all the trauma, all of it, how are you still this person who continues to try, continues to try and be this compassionate, empathetic, understanding, loving human being?
I love this question. And like you said, we do pose it to anyone listening, because if it's anything you and I know, is everyone has a story. Everyone knows suffering. The details are different, but everyone knows suffering. No one escapes this life without it. And I love the question because we can often forget what we've overcome. Can often forget how far we've come. We can
Yep.
forget the progress we've made. We can forget what a freaking miracle it is that we're still standing.
Mhm.
And it depends, you could say what background, what happened, all the different things. Like I said, details are different, but suffering is suffering.
Mhm.
So, and I
Well,
love
and
that
also,
you ask yourself this question. So I'm going to circle back to you because I don't want to be
yeah,
the focus. I'm going to
you love
circle back
making
to
me
you because we talked about this the last podcast.
sure. Yeah. Yep.
How did you come upon this question?
Well, I kind of came upon it in a couple of different ways. I feel like everything in my life has sort of brought me to this place. I feel like the universe has been trying to knock on my window for a while. I was just unable to really hear it, or see my life this way because I was constantly sort of fomenting this narrative about my life. And if I wasn't careful, I would sort of fall into this place of like, woe, of sort of I hate to admit it, but like a victim saturated narrative. Like, what was so wrong with me that these people would treat me this way, that I was not accepted into that group, that I was bullied in the fashion that I was bullied, that, my parents treated me the way that I did, or that they did. Um, I think we can become quite focused on that, and we adopt that narrative and those feelings, and it sort of cuts the legs out from under us. And that's what had happened to me for a very long time. And so for a very long time, if I wasn't careful, if I was in sort of a collapsed version of myself, I would adopt that narrative, and it. You would see me
Mhm.
do it. And those were often some of my darkest days, and days that I would have to kind of pull myself out of. And so one day, and I'm not exactly sure what brought me to this place, but I know I was working with narrative work, and I was sort of working with the narrative as it pertained to something in my business, clients. And what I did is I decided to try to use some of this stuff on myself. I mean, look, maybe it would work for me. I don't know. Um, and I started to reauthor my own narrative. I started to look at the story of my life from a different part of myself. And it only took me a glimpse to see it, right? Because for those who have read my book or know me at all, they know that my mom was 14 when she had me. I came from abject poverty. Um, and that gave me the experience that it did. And I looked at that narrative from a different perspective, and I thought to myself, I don't know what brought me there, but I had this glimpse that said, how are you that strong? How could
Mhm.
you have survived that? The math didn't work for me, as it didn't work for you. When I looked at your life, it's like, how is she still this person? I think actually now that I think about it, not looking at your life helped me kind of look at my own, because the math doesn't work when I look at what you went through and how you were treated, and you're still this person, like this amazing, beautiful person. And then I had to look at myself. Never ask a client or a wife to walk a path you're unwilling to walk yourself. And I looked at myself and I thought to myself, holy shit, it works for you too. How have you been this strong? How has this not absolutely destroyed you? Because it
Right.
could have. And
Mhm.
in that moment, I saw the strength. I saw the resilience. I saw the beauty in the journey, and the heroism, if I may be so bold to call myself that. But yeah, man. And it gave me this sense of like deep love of myself and of the journey that I've been on, rather than looking at it and going, oh man, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to tell anybody about that. I don't want to feel that. I look at that journey now and I say, holy shit,
Mhm.
you I look at all those parts of me that went through it, and you extraordinary and amazing beings, and that is now fueling the light that lives inside of me.
Well, it's so incredible that perspective can be a shift on the dial and to go from a victim place to like a heroic place with
Mm-hmm.
seeing that story in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, look, something abuse of any kind makes you believe you're a piece of shit,
Mm-hmm.
physical, emotional, sexual abuse, and I think something that many of us have going against us is one, we're brought into a culture that says we are inherently bad. We are inherently bad the minute we're born. And then I think there is more of an epidemic of trauma that comes from being parented by authoritarian parents of a certain
Mm-hmm.
generations. That's more prevalent than we think, and that type of parenting also makes you feel like you're a piece of shit, that you're not worth anything. And a lot of that authoritarian parent has emotional and physical abuse. Children are not valued in our culture. I think it's changing, but historically they have not been valued.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so what I'm saying is that those of us that come from this type of background, whatever degree it is, we're starting from a deficit perspective. We're starting from there is something wrong with me or I'm bad. We are
Well, you
starting
have to
from
make
what'd you
you
say?
you have to be bad
Mhm.
because you can't make your parents bad, right? From that object relations theory perspective, right? That's what we do. And
Yeah,
clients are often surprised when I tell them, I'm like, no, you make yourself bad because it's unsafe to make your parents bad.
right.
And they're like, wait, what?
So
Right? Because you, and I'm
add
like,
that in.
yeah. So your parent has to be good, and something inside you as a child must make the parent good, and therefore you become the bad person in the story, because to make the
Mm,
parent bad means that your world is unsafe. And so
right.
this is one that people have a hard time sort of wrapping the brain around or getting rid of, right? That I'm not bad. When we have poor parenting or neglect, right, we'll put it on ourselves rather than blame it on them. I've made that point already.
Yeah, that because we can't know that the adults in our lives are out of control or not functioning highly. So we have to believe that there must be something wrong with us that they're reacting to us that way. So if you think about it from a religious perspective, which many people in this culture,
Mm-hmm.
we're brought up that we're sinners. The minute we're born, we come into this world sinners. So that's one thing that we have going against us. Then we have the parenting style that makes us feel like we're not valued as beings, that children don't have opinions. They're not to be seen or heard. And I know, again, we're evolving out of this, hopefully, but there are still many people that use authoritarian parent techniques. And then you have also the abuse aspect where when your parents are out of control, you believe that you're bad,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't imagine that the adults in your life are out of control. So there's these three things for many of us that we're facing that build into the structure of our nervous system and our belief system about ourselves. So we don't go through this life taking stock or celebrating our goodness or our value. We don't feel valuable. And we're coming from that deficit perspective at life. And I think for me, one of the hardest things for me to work through was feeling like I am a valuable being, no matter what the feedback I've received as an adult, to undo the belief that I am bad or shameful has been so hard. It's like I just feel like I'm constantly fighting this energy that's bigger than me because it can always defeat me because my mind will always go, yeah, and
Well,
it'll
that's in the
always
small
prove why
fibers
I'm
of our
not worthy.
being. Yeah, well, that's in
Yes.
the small fibers for all the reason you're saying, and perhaps more, right?
Mm,
That we are born in sin, we are born bad, and add to that, we are cultured, especially in a capitalistic culture, that all of our value comes from what we produce.
yes.
There's
The
no, I
pursuit
said
of
to a client,
happiness.
right? And it's outside of us. It's an external pursuit. Anything that you do as a value makes you valuable. And this question sort of turns everything on its head. And the thing that we try to parent our boys through is that you have intrinsic value, just
Hmm.
as you are, as the sentient being that you are. You have intrinsic value. Now, I offered this to a client once, and he's a hard charging, external pursuit, very successful person, and from a culture, and it's an Indian culture, and so the pursuit of greatness, of goodness, comes from your how much money you're making, and the letters after your name, what school you went to. All of those external pursuits really are held in that culture and in his familial culture in high regard. And I know that's true for a lot of us, but when I offered it to him that he had intrinsic goodness, he literally just looked at me and he goes, "That's not a thing."
Mm,
I said, so you're saying that there's no one, so you can look at your kids and say that born when they came out of the womb, there's no intrinsic value. They said, well, it's what you do. And
mm,
so helping to sort of right the ship for him and turn him back to himself and teach them that actually there is intrinsic goodness, there is intrinsic value in you as a being. Man, that's a hard pill for people to swallow, for sure.
Well, it goes against so many of the belief systems. And, you know, when I look at spirituality and what it's taught me is that we are all divine beings, that whether you want to call it God, universe, spirit, that we are all sparks of the divine manifested in this life. And we are miracles, that we are the divine chose to manifest itself as us, which to me is an incredible thing and is a very different story than what we were talking about earlier. It's a very, very different way of living and being when I see what you're saying, what a miracle we are, how magical we are. We're missing out on so much of life coming at it from we are always at a deficit perspective of, or that we're bad. It's very depressing. It's very depressing to feel and believe that we are bad and unworthy.
Well, you're starting in a deficit. You're not even starting at zero. It's like you're born bad, and you don't, and until you do something of value and of worth, then I guess you're not really worth much. But this question has the propensity to change personal history with regard to the story that we've told about ourselves, right? And I think that's a really powerful thing to consider, that our personal history, I did this thing, I didn't do that thing, I was unsuccessful in this regard, that never worked out for me, these people treated me that way. None of those things actually shift and change, right? You still didn't get into that college and you didn't get that job, but the story that you tell around that shifts and changes, right? Mm-hmm. When you begin to look at how resilient you've been, when you begin to see yourself not for the value that would have created, but for the value that lives within you now, we begin to rewrite that personal history, that tale of woe, that what can often be a victim-saturated narrative, suddenly shifts, changes, and we start feeling differently about ourselves. And I can tell you from personal experience, that's what happened for me, is I began to look upon myself in a much, much different way. And I can't say enough about what that means to personal work. And so when I've asked clients to consider this, I'm often met with this like vacant look and silence, because I can see in that moment as they're recalibrating, and there's a push pull with the parts of them within who are going, wait a minute, you're shaking this whole thing up. Like the way I've lived my life, the way I've gone through everything is I'm kind of some version of a piece of shit. Sometimes I'm okay, but most of the time I'm kind of a piece of shit. Suddenly you have this tidal wave of, oh my God, this is different. Or I get it just sort of dismissed out of hand.
Well, I was going to ask you, what do you do? What do you do when someone is attached to the victim narrative? Mm-hmm. How do you handle that?
Well, it's a delicate balance, right? Because you are going up against how they've deemed themselves, how they've named themselves, how they've labeled themselves, the way they believe about themselves. And so you can't, as a therapist, I don't want to make myself the enemy, but I also don't want to, and so sometimes I'll call it out and say, look, I know you felt like this for a very long time, and there's a part of you up that is going to hold fast to this narrative, because to believe otherwise is to be somebody entirely different, and that's a lot. But I'm going to hold over here for you that there's a different narrative. There's another story. There's a different way to look at your life and a different way of looking at yourself. I'm going to hold that you are in fact good until you're ready to take it. And I'm going to keep pushing back. So just expect. Mm-hmm.
And I want to be clear that we're not talking about, like, there is a time in therapy where we need to talk about the things that have happened to us, and we need to explore, I would say, being a victim to those things. I'm not talking about victimhood, sure. But what we're talking about is when somebody, right, when somebody's been doing work on themselves and they're still really struggling to see their goodness after all this time. And when you posed the question to me, I was in this transition period, and I remember we had kind of a moment, like I lit up in the kitchen and I was like, I hear what you're saying, but I can't feel it. I am trying, I would have this image of me like with these big wings on my back, and I couldn't figure out the muscles to make them work, you know?
Mm.
Um,
Interesting.
and they would just hang heavy on my back. And I was like, I can see the wings. I just can't get them to spread and fly. And what I started doing was just, well, for me, I actually imagined those wings spreading. I would imagine, like, in moments where I felt scared or bad or not so great, I would imagine those wings spread out and bigger. And then I started kind of enjoying that image. And then I started imagining, like, okay, in this scenario, I can feel bad about myself, but what would it be like to see that I'm good in this scenario, or I'm valuable? Or, um, and I started playing back moments as a child, and I would think about my inner child and try to see who she actually was rather than who she was taught she was, if that makes sense.
Well, the question, the way it's posed, you can't get away from the truth. I mean, you
Right.
could try,
I'm
and
standing here.
even
You
you,
can't get away from it.
well, right, and you're a great mom, and you're a great partner, and you're a really good therapist, and you're a really good medium, and you've lived this life that is antithetical to the life that you had. It's antithetical to the way you were treated. There's no good reason for you to be here, and this is where we come upon the image of the dystopian flower. And I
Mm,
did an Instagram reel about that, and that idea was also part of what fomented the question. Is I was sort of working with this dystopian flower, and I saw an image, and a lot of people know what that is. It's a flower that's growing out of like a craggy rock, a broken sidewalk. There's no good reason for this beautiful organic thing to be in this um, in this setting. And I often would think about you in that regard. Whenever I would see something like that, I was like, oh, that's her. She's this dystopian flower. And I have a lot of clients that I see that way too. I didn't turn it on myself and think of myself in that way. But then I put the reel up and talked about these dystopian flowers that I have. I said I'm married to one, and it's this idea that there is no good reason for this beautiful being to be to be.
mm,
And then one of my clients who saw it wrote me back and said, "Yeah, that's you too." I was like, "Oh
mm,
shit, that's right." Um, but yeah, that's the way I've always seen you. Is that there's
which
just
I
no
always
good
think it's
reason.
interesting.
Why?
And you've never seen yourself that way, which I always think, how,
Well, I'm
I
also
mean,
the
you,
guy that
you
went
only
through four
share.
years. I'm also the guy that went through 4 years of Helix without any trauma, right?
Right.
So
It's so annoying. It's so annoying. And like when you share your story, you only share like 10% of it. I mean, at some point we're going to get into like but there's so many layers there that you have survived, so many people that got in the way and mistreated you. I mean, and for
like
you
went
not
out
to
of their
see
way to
it,
get in the way. Went out of their
yeah,
way to get in the way.
to
Yeah, to
get in
be a
the way.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for
Like it
you
was their
not to
job.
see it. So in those moments, I guess what you're saying is like when you're struggling, I think what that question you posed has been so helpful for me in the past few months, a couple months. I feel like it's been so recent of just like seeing my life in a different way. Like, yeah, despite all that, here I am with my good intentions and trying and showing up in the way that I am. And I still have a loving heart. And that is a miracle.
Yeah. I want to circle back because I think you touched on a point that's really important, as you often do, which is, and these are my words for it, like pop psychology, and the rash of coaching and sort of get over it therapy would tell you that, yeah, just go to this question. I'm not advocating for that to be first. It's important to go there soon, but it is important to look over your life and have your feelings and to understand and to grieve and to have your sadness. When you said, you asked me about how do I work with that narrative. It's like, I want people to look at it. I just don't want them to stare at it.
Right.
I want them to consider it and to grieve for that child in them, the part of them that didn't get the love that they needed, that didn't get the unconditional positive regard that we all want, that didn't feel loved, that didn't feel safe, that didn't feel like they mattered to someone. You need to be present for that grief, and feel some of that sadness. And what I often tell my clients is, look, if the emotions that these experiences create as a river, go to the bank of that river, but do not jump in, right?
Mhm.
We want to mindfully go to the bank of those emotions. We don't want to jump in the current. We will get washed away in our own emotions. We'll drown in our own emotions if we're not careful. We will adopt that victim saturated narrative. We'll become quite myopic in how we see how we've lived our lives. But standing on that proverbial bank and just being a witness to the landscape of your life, but from almost an objective perspective of, wow, that was sad. That was hard. This was difficult. I can feel those feelings. I can grieve for those experiences, but then I can also not adopt that narrative. And I can say, holy shit, look at me.
Mm.
And I know that even
And I
as
want
I
to
say,
speak.
holy
Oh, go
shit,
ahead.
look at me, that people, I say, holy shit, look at me. Even though when I say that, I'm kind of like, oh, are we allowed to say that? We should probably say that a little bit more
Yes.
often. Look at me.
Yes.
Look at what I did.
Look at you.
Yeah.
Look at you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, celebration. I've been saying this everywhere. In a channeling session, one of the big themes this year that came through was celebration, that we need to celebrate the wins in our lives. We need to celebrate each other. We need to celebrate how far we've come. We spend so much time picking apart what's not right, and we don't spend equal amount of time celebrating like, I'm here. I did this. I survived. I'm trying. And that energy is so important. We need to match the energy in the other direction. It's
Mm-hmm.
very important. So look at you, look at me, we're here.
Yeah. And so I encourage anyone who's listening to ask themselves that question. Like, look at your life and ask yourself, like, how are you still here? How are you still here
And
doing this thing, working so hard, trying so hard, still loving, still compassionate, still empathetic, understanding, right? What's your version of that dystopian flower?
what
I
does
guess
that look
that's the
like?
practice of love for this podcast.
Yeah, for this episode.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that is the practice.
Yeah. You have anything
It's a
else?
game changer. I was just going to say it's a game changer, and
It
it
really
takes
is.
vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
It's vulnerable to let go enough to see a different version of yourself rather than to hold tight, because sometimes hope is hard. Hope is hard for some people. So sometimes when I say easier, I hope everyone knows what I'm saying. It's not easier, but sometimes it's just what's known to hold on to the negative narrative about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
It can be so ingrained. And so to try to believe that there's something different, for the fear that someone, like, so if I say that I am different, I am a miracle, and the fear of someone proving that wrong, some people live with that fear. So there is a vulnerability in it. There's a need to stand firm in that belief, to grow legs around it.
Yeah.
That no matter what happens, you know that you're a miracle and that no one can
Mm-hmm.
take that from you.
Right. And I throw around that word narrative a bit, right? Narrative, stories that we tell, and we kind of think, it's not, there are thoughts, no big deal. Actually, it's a really big deal. I read a recent study that said that we have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 70,000 thoughts on any given day. About
Ugh.
85% of those thoughts are negative. About 90% of those thoughts are on repeat. And so, yeah,
Wow.
so we are inundating ourselves with negativity on a daily basis. Now, the science on that says I have thoughts, and we think not a big deal because the thoughts, we have 70,000 of them. It's like a sheet of paper and a ream of paper, not a big deal. It actually is a big deal, because if we're doing the math on it, we're having a lot of negative thoughts on repeat. Those thoughts fire off a chemical response in the body. We call it a feeling. That feeling fires off a thought, and that thought fires off another. So then we begin to foment belief systems now. So our narratives, at their core, they tell us what we get, what we don't get, who we are, who we're not, right? And so we have to be really careful with the stories that we tell about ourselves. If we want to have the life that we want to have, if we want to attract and create the things that we want to attract and create in our lives, start with your belief systems. And that is moment to moment. What's the story I'm telling? And is it a victim saturated story, or is it a tale where I get to look at myself and go, wow. And that brings me back to that intrinsic goodness.
I love that. I would encourage, as a practice, if someone has a hard time believing this in totality about themselves, but if you can find one thing to
Mhm.
celebrate about yourself on a daily basis, one thing,
Mhm.
like in the midst of all the criticism and all the looking, if you can find one thing, today I did this, or I've come this far, and really feeling the energy of that celebration is so
Yeah.
important.
What you're talking about is like you're finding gratitude naturally, right? So people talk
Mm,
about gratitude practice ad nauseum, and I've tried it, and for me, and I'm sure there's people out there like me, sometimes I have a hard time getting there, like just
yeah.
to sort of, you know, think kindly about myself and to come up with these reasons that I'm grateful for the sun on my face and I'm grateful for the house that we have. Yeah, those get me there a little bit, but this way of thinking, this way of doing it brings us into a deep sense of gratitude that you feel in your, I mean, in the small fibers of your existence. At least I do. And one of the ways that I do that, and it's as you're going to laugh because you've been telling me this for years and I wouldn't get on board, journaling.
Mm,
Yeah.
it's amazing. Such a novel idea.
Well, it actually seems to work. And there was a study out of the University of Pennsylvania not too long ago that talked about gratitude practice and writing it down.
Mm,
And that there was I'm not sure what percentage happier people were or more grateful people were, but people were substantially more grateful and happier people when they wrote their gratitude practices down. And so I thought that was interesting. And so I decided that I would, go ahead and dive in. And I can tell you, it's been a game changer to write that narrative and use the prompt. It's even hard to say out loud. Use that prompt of how are you who you are?
mm,
How are you this person? And then allow that to sort of cascade from there. And then
that's a
before you
great
know it,
prompt.
yeah. And before you know it, you're in this place of looking at yourself in a new way. And I like to use this as a launch pad for my day,
Mm,
to really dig into that story and write that all out. And before I know it, I'm feeling incredibly grateful about all that I have and all the people around me. It really is. It changes everything for me.
mm. I love that you shared that.
Because you're right.
No,
Again.
no, actually, because I think it's, I think it's really beautiful that this has become a practice for you to land in. Because I've watched you struggle. This has been a journey. I mean, a
Mhm.
really long journey of working with this old narrative, and that you've found a place to appreciate and see your life in a different way is
Mhm.
huge. It's huge. So I
Well, I
celebrate
found
you.
Yeah, well, I find myself in the midst of writing a book about intrinsic goodness and coming back to that life is a circle, and it's like I was still continuing to look for all of my goodness and my validation in the things that I was creating and the things that I was doing, rather than coming back to myself. And this practice has really allowed me to come back to in full circle to myself and to recognize, I keep using that term, but the intrinsic goodness that lives within me. And so,
Hmm.
I encourage people to just try it. And, maybe it doesn't work the first few times, but stay with it, dig in, and keep looking at the stories that you're telling, because those thoughts do become feelings. And if you can shift your narrative, you will shift how you feel about yourself.
Definitely.
All right,
Definitely.
I got to go.
Yeah, I'm good. We're
So
good.
thanks for joining us again for this episode of The Practice
The-
of Love. That was close. I almost did.
oh, wow.
Um, If you want to learn more about my work, you can check out my book called The Practice of Love. It's a book ostensibly about couples and relationships, but really it's about the relationship we have with ourselves. You can also check me out at Lair Torrent Holistic Therapist on Instagram. Ash?
Yeah, you can check me out at Ashley Torrent 29 on Instagram. And if you're interested in developing your intuition or spiritual mediumship skills, I will be beginning a class in January. Details will be up on my website and Instagram page, probably by the time this episode is out. So I'd love to have you there. It's a fun class, it's an experiential class. So I hope you join me.
Yeah, if you want to listen to how life is speaking to you and how your soul is whispering in your ear all the time, you should take this class.
Mm, yeah, we got to do a podcast about that.
Yeah.
Magic on Wonder. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Love you.
Love you.
Bye.